The question of should I reroll or not always comes down to two things. One, how long does it take? And two, will I get some major advantage in doing so? The good news about rerolling is that there's an in-game option to delete save data, meaning you don't have to waste time with those dummy emails. The bad news is that it can take up to 20 minutes per reroll attempt. This does take a little bit longer than other gachas. And now for the worst news, everything is confirmed to change at launch, and rating characters based on zero gear information is largely worthless. Chaos Zero Nightmare as a game will fundamentally change how units are used based on their saved data. Now, if you're someone who wants to just reroll for your favorite characters, maybe you love Hugo, then I'd say just go with it and ignore the rest of this video. At the time of this recording, I do not think that any 5-star hit will brick your account or otherwise limit your progression. If you take nothing else away from this video, I would say hope for your favorites 5-star and a single copy of Maribel, which I'll explain more later. At its core, Chaos Zero Nightmare as a game is going to reward players who have more characters on their account than a handful of special interests. This is ultimately what separates Chaos Zero Nightmare from the majority of gacha games on the market, and will be a frustration point for people who try to focus certain teams. You will need to be able to change out units based on what the boss is doing. Now, with that in mind, it's important to understand what we get character-wise for free and any gaps that might exist. Again, a key focus here is making the best overall account and not hyper-focusing on one exact team that you're going to end up with hating later as you try to get hard countered by a boss and getting that more difficult content. Ultimately, if you want to understand why it's important to have multiple characters and hear about my personal recommendations for rerolling, then that is what the rest of this video will be focused around. Now, with that said, first we have to talk about the units that we get at launch. Owen is a character that no one really is excited for or maybe talks about, but his kit is surprisingly decent and can be built out to fit multiple teams. I plan to do a much more in-depth video later on talking about each one of these characters and their different builds, but a key thing to note with Owen is thanks to his wind charge upgrades and general shielding in his kit tied to attack cards, you can build him to be the main focus if you're missing that element for damage, and has a shocking amount of synergy with other Chaos Zero Nightmare characters. One character in particular that I have to mention here is going to be Selena, because she can directly buff the output of damage from Owen, giving you a very solid 4-star based passion team. Early on in limited playtests, we saw many enemies that were weak to this element, where Owen is going to be just a nice character to have for early game progression. Next up, we have Mika, who gets talked about, well, in a much more positive way, but that's largely due to the fact that she's a nice band-aid fix for action point fixing before you get to that point where you're hyper-refining agent decks prior to endgame and the chaos mode at the very end. Now, don't get me wrong, she's an absolute MVP for healing and letting you play extra cards per turn, but I have a very strong feeling that she will fall off towards the endgame once decks get refined more. As soon as you no longer rely on the extra action points every turn as a crutch, you'll quickly find areas where Cassius or even Nia are better to slot in over her. That said, in terms of early gameplay, she will be something you auto-include into every single team for a healing option, but important to note that you will still gain the stress debuff if you don't have a shield, which we will cover later. That said, just know up front, Blessing of Waves is an absolute god tier card that will carry you through the majority of the early game, if not also early end game, for how much value you get out of that single card, and as well the extra action point generation that I had previously mentioned. Now, compared to the last two characters we talked about, Tressa is what we would call a greedy damage dealer that doesn't have as much flexibility and wants to be the main action point spender of the team. Now, she does have some interaction with Kairon, a 5-star, but that's outside the scope of this video overall. Tressa is all about dealing damage over time by stacking up Agony and then leaning into a big payoff attack cards like Vital Attack that will burst down a boss. Where Owen has a bit more flexibility in his kit and can deal AoE damage fairly consistently, which is really important for farming stages, Tressa is all about single target buildup. Between these two characters, we have a good mix of both single target and AoE focused damage, so at least at a high level, the game does equip you with enough offensive characters to start farming and getting to invest in your save data. Between the two of these, you should be able to get through the early game and also have a clear quick time on those farming stages where Owen can really shine as well. Lastly, for free characters, we have Amir. While she is great at giving you a passive damage reduction through Metalize, her shield generation is virtually non-existent. Shields are great in that they prevent you from taking stress during your chaos runs, which prevents your characters from reaching their breakdown state, but Amir misses every checkbox on if she's good to bring as a support role to any team. While she can find a home in an all-defense-based team like Magna, Maribel, and Amir, she absolutely should not be used under any circumstances based on the information we have coming out of the limited playtest. Now, we do know that some amount of rebalancing will happen based on the dev video that I covered in a previous video, but ultimately her entire kit needs a bit of rework to fill that defensive role, so I can't imagine her getting better at launch. Because of this reason, we have one very clear thing that is missing, which is a dedicated shielding unit. For the sake of a quick breakdown of all the units, I'm going to include this image, which highlights key areas for the various supports as well. I want to be very clear, without knowing how the end game of Chaos Zero Nightmare is going to go, and before hearing about any nerfs to Calipe, it's impossible to give a definitive answer on who to target. What's worse is we will likely not know about any of these changes until launch, and players have more time to dig into the data to see what has changed. So if you're someone who wants to start right away from day one, likely there will just not be enough information out there because we have to wait for players to unlock memory fragments, which is going to take a couple days after launch, as well as seeing the other gear that we can get in Chaos 4 or Chaos 5. So there are a lot of variables that even if nothing changes, there still might be scenarios where going with Magna will actually be better than Calipe once we find out what that endgame looks like. Now, that said, at a high level, my number one recommendation would be pick whatever 5-star you want and also a copy of Maribel. If you truly want to spend infinite time to get an ideal start, you can't go wrong with a 5-star lineup and getting an otherwise solid defensive unit. I'd go as far to say that if you're targeting Magna, I would still try to get Maribel because the devs have directly stated already that some bosses at endgame will completely counter Magna's counterattack builds, so you'll want to combine her with Maribel to do more of the shield-based damage tricks instead. Again, leading to two very different ways that you can build out both of these characters based on the save data. And in addition, thanks to her extremely flexible ego skill that gives 350% shield as an uh-oh button, as well as an overall flexible kit that I previously mentioned can be built two different ways, Maribel is my only strong recommendation for characters that you would be happy to see in a reroll, combined again with the course of whatever your favorite 5-star is. Now, if you want my opinion on 5-star targets, again, based on everything that we've already covered in this video up until this point, it's going to come down to Luke and Calipe for me. While I just spent a good amount of time warning against Calipe, the important thing to highlight is the different type of element advantages we have, since this is a gacha at the end of the day. Order and Instinct, or green and orange, just based on the element colors, are the two that are missing from the previously discussed characters, and we know that Haru, the first limited character, is going to be Justice or blue. As someone who is rushing to the endgame for the sake of creating guides and helping out other people build up their characters, having key units for every element is going to be important for various showcases. We do not know all the different elemental advantages that will appear in endgame, so having a nice coverage of units is going to be vastly more important than stacking up, say, a mono-element team. Now, Luke, I need to give a shout out since so many people are not talking about him because he can draw extra cards and increase his own damage all in one. He does require a bit of setup, and he will need time investment into memory fragments to get his crit damage up. But once we get the right gear and save data for him, his damage per turn numbers are going to be insane because of how his kit works. Now, I do think Luke overall will take, again, a lot of time investment to really build out his kit and make him worth it, and we might even see other units down the road that replace his element, but I think for at least early on in the game's life, and having that elemental coverage really makes Luke a very nice candidate for a early 5-star that we are happy to hit. And that wraps up our detailed breakdown on the reroll topic to try and help players avoid some of the bad information out there. But ultimately, this is a game that will reward you for having multiple units to bring in and out of teams based on the content. So if you really want to go the distance, just try to get as many 5 stars as you want. Will give you the most options at the end of the day. As Chaos Zero Nightmare is only a couple weeks away, we'll be ramping up the content plan, so don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more detailed breakdowns like this on the particular characters leading up to launch. So until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay hydrated, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.